I'm Susan Mueller.
Art historians tell the story of human beings through the artworks they create. People have been making art for at least 35,000 years, since the Old Stone Age. Like their modern counterparts, these ancient humans recorded the environment in which they lived, making realistic drawings, paintings, and sculptures of the animals who shared their world, as well as a few images of themselves. Were these fertility objects, depictions of deities, or possibly portraits? It's impossible to say. They also left handprints, hundreds of them. Again, we cannot say why this was done. However, recent scholarship has shown that a number of these are women's handprints. So contrary to common belief, during the Stone Age, both men and women were artists. As we move forward in time to the late Neolithic period, the New Stone Age, artists begin recording scenes of daily life, such as hunting scenes, as well as historical events. This painting from the Neolithic settlement known as Cathedrals in Turkey dates from around 7000 BC. It depicts a village in the foreground and in the background an erupting volcano. This volcano is Mount Hassan, and it looks the same today, except for its peak, which was blown off during that ancient eruption. By 3000 BC, 5,000 years ago, human beings leave the Stone Age and prehistory and enter the Bronze Age and what is known as historic time. So called because that was when writing was invented. Note that human prehistoric time lasted more than 300 million years. Historic time, however, has only lasted a measly 5,000 years, from the Bronze Age until today. Seems a lot longer, doesn't it? Writing gave people the means to record their history in a way that others can read and understand. Scenes of daily life, images of deities, depictions of historical events, and portraits of living human beings, important people as well as ordinary people, become the main subjects for art. So now, thanks to the written record, we in modern times can better understand the meaning of the artworks created by our long ago ancestors. Although we can never know the precise meaning of the cave paintings and the images of people from prehistory, we do know for certain that this inscription from around 1250 BC on a pillar at the Temple of Karnak concerns the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II, because that's his name written on it. Here is where art history comes in. One of the things art historians do is to put faces to names. Here's a portrait of Ramses II, idealized to be sure, as most portraits of famous people usually are, even today. However, it certainly does have his facial features and shows how he looked in life, at least as a young man. But we have his mummified body, so we can check it out for ourselves, with one complication. Ramses II died in his late 80s, possibly even at age 90, after having been ill for some time. Therefore, modern facial reconstructions made from the mummy usually depict a very elderly man, not the young man he once was. Here is one I made of the elderly Ramses. And here's another one I made using a sculpture of the pharaoh as he looked in his prime. By the way, the mummy's prominent hooked nose is the result of the tightly wrapped mummy bandages, which flattened the cartilage. Ramses' nose in life would have looked more like this, as we see in his portraits. All this is part of what art historians do. It's not a discipline based solely on memorizing dates of artworks, artist names, and styles, as some students, actually many students, seem to think. Art historians reconstruct the past by working alongside of archaeologists, scientists, and scholars from many disciplines, as well as historians who focus on the written record. Here are some concrete examples. This is a fresco painting discovered in the Roman city of Pompeii, one of the cities destroyed by the eruption of the volcano Vesuvius in 79 AD. It depicts the amphitheater and gladiator training school, which have actually been discovered and excavated by archaeologists. And here is a photo of the amphitheater itself as it looks today, after excavation. See the difference? What does this difference mean? Well, according to the written record, the Pompeii amphitheater was built around 70 BC when Pompeii first became a Roman colony. But some 90 years later, in 62 AD, it was damaged by an earthquake and had to be repaired. So what we are seeing in the painting is the amphitheater as it looked before the earthquake. The amphitheater as it looks now is the repaired amphitheater. The repairs reduced the number of arches and made the stairway less steep and the landing larger, probably much safer for fans. So here are the kinds of things art historians use to draw conclusions about the past. The written record, scientific and archaeological discoveries, and the artworks, monuments, and artifacts themselves, which include clothing, the emphasis of my original undergraduate major, historical costume. Studying what people wore is a great way to understand past cultures and to explain what's going on in works of art. There are an amazing number of old dresses, shoes, and other items of clothing available for study. Here is the burial gown of Eleonora de Toledo, a shoe worn by Marie Antoinette at her execution, the clothing worn by a medieval murder victim whose body was thrown into a Swedish bog. You are probably very familiar with a toga party, in which people dress up in white bedsheets. Why white specifically? Well, that comes from the common misperception that the ancient Greeks and Romans dressed almost exclusively in white. They didn't, of course. Artworks show them dressed in all sorts of bright colors, as well as in patterned and lavishly embroidered fabrics. This movie costume designer got it right. The mistaken idea that they dressed only in white comes from two sources. First, because most ancient Greek and Roman sculpture is made from white marble, the assumption has always been that the clothes themselves must have been white. And second, several styles of Roman togas, such as the toga pura and the toga candida, were indeed made of white wool. But the written record tells us that other togas were black, gray, purple, or red, and the toga picta, or painted toga, was multicolored, lavishly embroidered, and very showy. Thus, it was a favorite of the emperors. The same holds true for the ancient Greeks. They did not dress in all white either, but in many different colors. They were especially fond of patterned fabrics, such as checks and polka dots, both woven and embroidered. None of this should come as a surprise to anyone who has ever seen a Greek vase painting, a Tanagra figurine, or a Roman fresco. Here is how the ancient Greeks and Romans really dressed, in brightly colored clothes with lots of patterning. And this is how their sculptures looked when new. Yes, Greek and Roman sculptures were painted in very bright colors to reflect actual garments. Surprised? Most people are. Even some art historians are surprised, although they shouldn't be, since a number of ancient sculptures retained some of their original paint. And there are lots of garments and fabrics surviving from ancient times, and most of them are not white. It was a scientific breakthrough made in 2006 by German archaeologists Vinzenz Brinkmann and Ulrike Koch-Brinkmann that convinced almost everyone that ancient sculptures were painted. Using a complicated technique involving chromatography, mass spectrometry, a raking light, and ultraviolet photography, they were able to discover the chemical makeup and thus the colors of the paints used by the original artists. Referred to as chroma, replicas of Greek and Roman sculpture depicted in their original colors are now displayed in museums and shown widely online, giving us a more accurate idea of how the ancient world really looked. More like Las Vegas than Washington, D.C. And the same technology has shown that the sculptures on the facades of medieval cathedrals were also brightly painted. Again, this shouldn't come as a surprise, since many sculptures and wall decorations inside the cathedrals still retain their original paint colors because they have been protected from the elements. However, it took art historians working alongside of many other disciplines to finally make that connection. And speaking of cathedrals and Christianity, have you ever thought about why members of the clergy dress the way they do? Even if you're not Christian, you have probably seen news footage of the Pope or the Archbishop of Canterbury dressed in elaborate garments known as liturgical vestments. Well, these vestments are not medieval, as you probably thought. They are actually based on clothing worn during the late Roman Empire and early Byzantine periods. In fact, today's traditional church vestments look almost identical to how an upper-class man or woman would have dressed in the 4th and 5th centuries A.D. In this painting, found in the Christian burial catacombs in Rome, we see a stola, a stole, or a kind of long scarf. This is a dalmatic, a caftan-like garment that originated in Dalmatia, like the Dalmatian dog. This outer garment, similar to a poncho, was called a casula by the Romans. They are still called cassulas or chasubles in the Anglican Church. And of course, everyone in the ancient world wore a tunic. Tunics in white are called tunica alba, or simply an alb in English. Here's an alb worn under a chasuble. As time passed, these garments, which were once just ordinary clothing worn by ordinary citizens, became standardized as church vestments. Compare the clothing worn by Sant Apollinari in the 6th century mosaic from Ravenna, Italy, with how the Christian clergy still dress. You can't miss it. Here's the progression. From the imperial Roman toga picta, to late Roman and Byzantine secular dress, to modern Christian liturgical vestments. For the 10-Minute Professor, this is Dr. Susan Ray Euler. Thanks for tuning in.